Nights at the crematorium have a silence that no one ever really gets used to. It is not the kind of silence you find in a library, or in a church, or even in the dead of night when the streets outside are empty. It is a different kind of quiet, dense, heavy, like a thick curtain draped across every sound. I used to think of it as the silence of endings. After all, by the time a body reaches my hands, its story has already been written. My job is not to add to it, only to finish the last chapter, clean and efficient, and return what remains to whoever is waiting. But on nights like this, when I walk through the long corridors lined with closed doors and the low hum of machinery, I can't help but feel that the silence here doesn't belong to the dead at all. It belongs to the building itself, like the walls are holding their breath. I clocked in as usual, a little before 10. The air outside was brisk. The parking lot empty except for my truck and the director's old sedan, which he always left parked by the side of the building, even though he rarely stayed past dusk. Inside, the temperature dropped a few degrees lower than comfortable ventilation systems designed to keep things cool, to keep the work efficient. The smell hit me like it always does. Chemical cleaners, steel, faint traces of smoke, baked into the very foundation. You live with it long enough, and it stops being unpleasant. It just becomes the scent of your work, something that clings to your clothes no matter how many times you wash them. Routine keeps you sane in this job. Without it, the mind starts to wander to places it shouldn't. That's why I always start the same way. Unlock the prep room, check the logs, review the night's schedule, then inspect the furnace chambers. The machines are old but reliable industrial-grade retorts, designed to reach temperatures high enough to break bone down to dust. The control panels blink with their usual steady lights, the switches stiff but responsive under my fingers. I check the seals, run a cloth over the glass inspection windows, listen to the faint hiss of the pilot lines. Everything must be precise. That's the only way you can trust yourself in a place like this. I like working nights. Less interruptions, less footsteps echoing down the hall, less of the world peering in through that single observation window. There's a rhythm to solitude that feels almost protective. You move slower, but with more purpose. The mop against the tile, the clink of metal instruments being set in order, the scratch of a pen across the logbook, all of it forms a kind of music only you can hear. Sometimes I hum along to it, just to remind myself that I'm still here, still breathing, still separate from the ones laid out on the tables around me. That night, though, the silence felt different. Too still, almost stubborn, like the air itself wanted me to notice it. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, but even that seemed muted, swallowed by the space. I paused in the prep room doorway longer than usual, watching the way my shadow stretched across the tiled floor, crisp and unmoving. I told myself it was just fatigue, third double shift in a week, sleep getting shallow, meals skipped in favor of strong coffee. But somewhere deep in my gut, there was a pull, a reminder that silence can sometimes mean more than absence. Still, the work doesn't wait for feelings. I set my thermos on the counter, shrugged off my jacket, and got to it. First, I reviewed the manifest. Only one scheduled cremation for the night. That was unusual. Most nights had 2, sometimes 3, but not unheard of. A solitary case, listed under Collins, Richard, male, mid-40s. Cause of death, motor vehicle accident. The notes were minimal, just enough for protocol. There would be no visitors, no family waiting in the viewing room, no questions asked. Just a body, a furnace, and me. Before retrieving him from refrigeration, I walked the length of the furnace room, boots clicking against tile. I ran a hand along the cool steel of the chamber doors, checking latches, making sure the temperature gauges read correctly. The machines loomed in their row like silent sentinels, their doors sealed tight, their glass eyes reflecting the glow of the overhead lamps. I've seen people flinch the first time they step into this room, as if the machines themselves are watching. To me, they're only tools. Tools don't watch. Tools don't care. But even so, there's a weight to the air here that never leaves. The kind of weight you feel in your chest, pressing down with the reminder that every action you take is final. There are no second chances in this room. Once the fire takes hold, it doesn't give anything back. I finished my inspection, checked the clipboards, and leaned against the counter for a moment. The clock on the wall ticked just past 11. The night outside had settled in completely, the windows reflecting nothing but my own face staring back. Another long shift, another body, another silence to tend to. Nothing unusual, I told myself. Just another lonely night at the crematorium. But even then, as I straightened my back and prepared to wheel Richard Collins out for his final passage, I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence around me wasn't empty at all. It felt too deliberate, too careful, as though something unseen was waiting with me in the shadows, patient, quiet, and ready. The refrigeration unit always greets you with a breath of air colder than the rest of the building. It's not just the temperature, it's the way it seeps into your skin, down to the bones, like stepping into a place where time itself has slowed to preserve what the world has already discarded. I keyed in the code, swung the heavy door open, and the scent of disinfectant mixed with that faint, unmistakable tang of preserved flesh drifted out. It's a smell you never quite forget, though you learn to live with it. Some nights, it feels sharper than others, like the air is reminding you where you are and what you do. Richard Collins was waiting for me inside, stored in drawer 12. The label was plain, the handwriting neat but impersonal. I pulled the tray out, the rails groaning slightly as they extended, revealing the black body bag zipped tight from crown to heel. There was no photograph clipped to the chart, no personal items placed on top, nothing to tether him to a life outside this place. Just the body, silent and heavy, ready for the fire. I always pause at that moment when the drawer first slides open. It's not ritual, not really. It's a habit born from years of doing this alone. A second of stillness to remind myself that whoever lies inside once woke up in the morning expecting to live another day. And now, all of it ends here, with me, in a cold room beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. Maybe it's my way of giving respect, in case no one else ever does. The bag was heavier than expected, though that could have been the fatigue settling into my arms. I gripped the edges, guided him carefully onto the stretcher, and locked the wheels before zipping the bag halfway down. Regulations. You check the tags, you confirm the identity, even when there's no family around to witness it. His face emerged pale under the glow, features stiff with the waxen stillness that only death creates. Mid-40s, just like the paperwork said. Faint bruising along the forehead, lips slightly parted. A man who probably thought he had years left. Now he was a number in a logbook. I brushed the tag with my thumb, double-checking the name. Collins Richard. No next of kin, no instructions, no religious preferences noted. When cases like this come in, it always gnaws at me a little more than the others. The ones with flowers, with families waiting in the reception area, with whispered prayers scribbled on folded notes. They leave behind echoes. But the forgotten ones? They arrive as blanks. No one speaks for them. No one stands to remember them. It makes the silence that much heavier. I wheeled the stretcher slowly down the hall toward the furnace chamber. The wheels squeaked in uneven bursts, each one a reminder that I was the only living person in that hallway. The observation window along the corridor showed nothing but the empty viewing room beyond. Chairs neatly aligned, the curtain pulled closed. If you've ever seen one of those rooms filled with grieving faces, you know the weight of shared sorrow. But emptiness has its own weight, and sometimes it feels worse. Tonight, that room was barren, just like the life I was about to consign to ash. Inside the chamber room, the machines stood waiting, hulking metal giants lined against the wall. I parked the stretcher beside the primary retort and locked the brakes. The sound echoed too loudly in the stillness, the clank of steel on steel like a hammer blow against the quiet. I unzipped the bag fully now, exposing him completely under the harsh surgical lights. There was nothing remarkable about his body average build, a scattering of scars from some old injuries. the faint stiffness of rigor already fading. And yet, standing there, looking down at him, I couldn't shake the thought that there should have been someone else here. A son, a daughter, a brother, even a neighbor. Someone to stand witness. Instead, it was just me. And maybe that's what unsettled me more than anything, that his final passage was entrusted to a stranger, whose name he never knew. My face would be the last face to look on him before the fire erased everything he once was. I moved with practiced efficiency, sliding the transfer board beneath him, adjusting his limbs so they lay straight, hands folded gently against the chest. These small gestures don't matter to the furnace, but they matter to me. Even when no one else is looking, there's dignity in arranging the dead as though they are still worth the care. I told myself I was only following procedure, but the truth is, procedure doesn't require compassion. That comes from somewhere else. As I adjusted his position, a faint groan of the stretcher wheels made me glance up. The chamber doors loomed, their steel faces unyielding, the small glass inspection windows catching reflections from the overhead lights. For a second, I thought I saw movement, just my own shadow shifting across the glass, distorted by the angle. I exhaled sharply, dismissing it. This was the fatigue again, the trick solitude plays. There was nothing there. There was only me, Richard Collins, and the waiting fire. I checked the tags one final time and set the paperwork aside on the clipboard. Everything was in order. Everything was as it should be. Yet the air pressed heavier in my lungs as I stood there, staring at the furnace, knowing what came next. There's a finality to this part of the job that never softens with time. No matter how many years you've worked, no matter how many bodies you've sent through those doors, the act of sliding a stretcher forward and sealing someone inside never feels routine. It feels like crossing a line you can't uncross. I tightened my gloves, steadied my breath, and placed both hands on the stretcher. The wheels unlocked with a snap. The silence of the room deepened, like even the walls were bracing themselves for the fire that was about to be called to life. And in that moment, for the first time that night, I realized just how absolute solitude could feel. Not just being alone, but being the only voice left to mark the passing of a man who would otherwise vanish without a trace. Richard Collins had no one else. He had only me. And the fire. There is a rhythm to starting the furnace that becomes second nature after so many years. I have performed the sequence more times than I could count, yet each time it carries a weight that routine never erases. I wheeled Richard Collins closer to the retort, the stretcher bumping gently against the base as I aligned it with the chamber doors. My hands rested on the rails for a moment, steadying myself, listening to the hum of the building around me. The air was still cold from the refrigeration unit, but already I could feel the anticipation of heat pressing at my thoughts, waiting to ignite. The preparation always begins with checks. You don't rush a process like this. One oversight, one careless mistake, and the results could be catastrophic, not just for the remains, but for the building, for me. I ran through the protocol line by line, as though my voice alone could anchor me to sanity. Pilot line open. Ignition system armed. Pressure valves steady. I touched the controls lightly, feeling the steel cool against my gloved fingers. The machines groaned faintly as the systems came alive, blinking lights flaring to steady green. I lowered my eyes to Richard. His face, pale and expressionless, stared upward beneath the harsh glow of the lamps. His hands lay folded neatly across his chest, a gesture that gave him the faint illusion of rest, as if he were only waiting to wake from a long, dreamless sleep. But I knew better. The fire does not wait for dreams. It consumes them. Sliding the stretcher forward is always the moment that sinks into the chest. The wheels rolled with a squeal as I guided him into position, the chamber swallowing his body inch by inch. The sound of steel on steel reverberated like a hollow echo. Once his form was inside, I paused again. Sometimes, when family is present, you hear sobs at this point, whispered prayers, final words. But there was nothing now, just silence so complete I could hear the faint thud of my own heartbeat. I closed the chamber doors, the latch clanking shut with a finality that resonated through the room. My reflection blinked back at me from the glass window, a distorted image, stretched by the curve of the pane, like I was staring at a stranger wearing my clothes. I forced myself to look past it, to the still outline within, faintly illuminated by the overhead light. He was ready. I turned the ignition key. A low hiss filled the chamber as gas lines opened, followed by the click-click of the igniter sparking to life. Then came the roar. Fire bloomed in an instant, a furious burst of heat and light that filled the chamber, consuming shadows, painting the walls in a violent orange. The sound was overwhelming, a deep, guttural thunder that vibrated through the floor beneath my boots. Even though I'd heard it countless times, it always carried with it the primal reminder that fire is alive, that it moves with hunger, with purpose. The temperature climbed rapidly, gauges ticking upward with steady precision. The air grew warmer in the room, the faint smell of gas giving way to the dry, acrid tang of burning matter. I kept my eyes fixed on the dials, making minute adjustments, ensuring the process unfolded within controlled parameters. My training guided my hands, but my thoughts strayed, as they always did. Who had Richard been? What had his final day looked like before it ended in twisted steel and shattered glass? Did he know he would leave this world with no one left to speak his name, except for me, whispering it under my breath as I wrote it in the logbook? The furnace roared on, steady, merciless. Through the glass I saw the faint shifting of forms, outlines blurred by flame. I knew it was only the distortion of heat waves, the tricks fire plays on the eyes. Yet there's always a moment, when you look too long, that your mind starts to see things, shapes, movements, the illusion of someone still struggling within. That's why most workers avoid looking through the window. But I've never been able to help myself. I look because the silence around me demands that I do, as if the dead deserve at least one witness to their last passage. Minutes passed. The gauges steadied, the roar of the flames settling into a rhythm that matched the pulse in my ears. My body grew warm beneath my uniform, sweat prickling along the base of my neck. I took a step back, resting against the counter, sipping from the thermos of lukewarm coffee I'd left earlier. The bitterness grounded me, though it did little to chase away the dryness in my throat. Every process begins like this. Routine, calculated, a balance of fire and steel. Yet no amount of repetition erases the unease of watching flesh reduced to smoke, bones broken down until they crumble into fragments. I tell myself it is only science combustion, temperature, chemical reactions. But the part of me that lingers in silence, that listens to the hum of the building at night, knows better. Science explains the mechanics. It does not explain the weight that presses in when you stand too close to the fire. I checked the logs again, scribbling notes in the margins, confirming the time, the temperature, the status of the burners. Everything was exactly as it should be. Yet as I wrote, I felt a strange pause in the air around me. Not a sound, not a shift, just the sensation that the room itself was listening, waiting. I glanced up at the furnace, flame still dancing beyond the glass, unwavering, nothing unusual, nothing at all. I told myself that again, firmly, as though the words could settle the unease in my chest. Nothing unusual. This was the beginning of the process, the part one had lived through countless times before. And yet, deep in the pit of my stomach, something twisted. Because as steady as the fire burned, as precise as the controls read, I couldn't shake the feeling that this night would not end like the others. The beginning had come. The fire had answered my call. But what it might reveal before the end, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. There is always a moment of silence that follows the roar of the furnace. When the burners are cut and the fuel line disengages, the sound falls away, leaving behind only the faint ticking of cooling metal and the hum of ventilation. It's a sound I've grown used to, a signal that the cycle has ended, that the fire has done its work, and now all that remains is ash. That night, I followed the same steps I always had. The gauges read steady, the time matched protocol, and my notes were in order. With a twist of the control lever, I shut off the burners. The roar collapsed into silence almost instantly, leaving only the low hiss of air being vented through the chamber. I leaned back, exhaling, feeling the tension in my shoulders release just a fraction. But then, something happened. It was faint at first, a shimmer in the corner of the glass, a flicker of light where there should have been only the dull glow of cooling embers. I frowned, leaning forward, thinking maybe the residual heat was refracting oddly through the chamber. I'd seen strange mirages before, the kind heat plays on tired eyes. But as I watched, the shimmer grew stronger, until it resolved into something impossible, a small flame, no bigger than the tip of my thumb, burning steadily in the center of the retort. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. The burners were off. I checked the gauges again. Fuel flow 0. Ignition disabled, pressure normal. There was no source, no reason for a flame to still be there. And yet it danced stubbornly, its blue-orange tongue licking upward in defiance of the silence. I told myself it was nothing. A pocket of gas not fully purged, maybe a bit of combustible residue left behind. These things happen, I reasoned. But even as I reached for the secondary purge system, a knot of unease twisted in my gut. The flame wasn't sputtering the way a dying ember should. It wasn't shrinking. It was holding steady, almost alive. I hit the purge valve. A rush of air surged through the chamber, the vents rattling as the system flushed. For a moment, the flame guttered, shrank, and I thought I had resolved it. But the second the hiss of the purge faded, it grew again, just as strong as before, if not brighter. A chill ran down my spine, despite the growing heat in the room. I glanced at the logbook on the counter, my pen resting exactly where I'd left it. The words "burn complete" written across the line. I hadn't even finished the note before something had gone wrong. I considered scratching it out, writing an amendment, but my hand hesitated above the page. To acknowledge it in writing felt like giving it weight, like admitting that what I was seeing wasn't just fatigue or imagination. The smell hit me next. Usually, once the burners are cut, the air grows cool and sterile, the heavy tongue of combustion fading back into neutrality. But that night, the scent thickened instead, acrid, bitter, like burning resin or charred wood. It clung to the back of my throat, heavy and unnatural. I swallowed against it, fighting the urge to cough, my eyes watering slightly. I walked back to the chamber window, drawn against my better judgment. The flame still burned in the middle, but now I swore it moved differently. Instead of flickering randomly, it swayed with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as though responding to something I couldn't see. It leaned, bent, stretched as if the flame itself were trying to form a shape, something almost human in outline. I stepped back quickly, bumping into the counter behind me, my thermos clattering to the floor. The clang echoed far too loudly in the quiet room, making me wince. The flame didn't react. It just continued its eerie, stubborn burn, taunting the rules of science that I had lived by all these years. I told myself again, technical error, residual fuel, malfunction in the valves. I reached for the control panel, flipping each switch one by one, confirming each line was closed. The system responded exactly as it should. Nothing was leaking. Nothing was wrong. By every measure, the fire should have been gone. But it wasn't. The minutes stretched painfully, each second amplifying the weight of what I was seeing. My mind ran through every explanation it could muster, each one thinner than the last. And through it all, that flame refused to die. I leaned against the counter, pressing my palms flat to the cold steel, grounding myself in the reality of touch, of texture. But when I closed my eyes, the image burned behind them, that small, defiant light, glowing in a place where no light should exist. When I opened them again, it was still there, unwavering. I don't scare easily. Years of working alone in this place have hardened me against the strange noises, the flickering shadows, the oppressive silence. But this was different. It wasn't just unusual. It was wrong, fundamentally wrong. And deep down, in a part of me I rarely let surface, I knew this was only the beginning. A flame had stayed when everything else told me it should have died. And in its persistence, I felt something more than fire staring back at me. Something that was not ready to leave. I thought I had put it out. After those long, unsettling minutes standing in front of the chamber window, I convinced myself that the flame had finally surrendered. It flickered, wavered, and then at last seemed to fade into nothing. I remember exhaling so hard my chest ached. The room was quiet again, only the soft hum of ventilation and the tick of cooling steel filling the air. I told myself it was over, but I should have known better. It couldn't have been more than 5 minutes later when the heat returned. Not all at once, not the full-bodied roar of the burners, but gradual like a fever, crawling back into the bones of the room. I noticed it first on my skin, a faint warmth against my forearms where they rested on the counter. Then, when I glanced at the gauges, I froze. The temperature was rising. Not fast, not dramatically, but steadily, as though the furnace had never shut down at all. I checked the fuel lines again closed, ignition off, purge valve sealed. Everything was exactly as it should be, and yet the numbers on the dial crept upward with stubborn defiance. I walked to the window, against every instinct screaming at me not to, and there it was. The flame had come back. This time it wasn't small, not a little ember or spark clinging desperately to life. No, this was a tongue of fire stretching tall and lean, licking the ceiling of the chamber, like it had been waiting for me to look away before it grew. The sight stopped me in my tracks. My heart hammered so hard I could feel the pulse in my throat, my ears. I muttered something under my breath, maybe a curse, maybe a prayer. I can't remember. The flame wasn't random anymore. It swirled in slow circles, curling in ways that looked intentional. For a brief, terrible moment, it resembled the shape of a spine, rising and bending as though something invisible was trying to stand upright inside the chamber. I staggered back, my hand hitting the wall to steady myself, but I couldn't look away. I told myself it had to be some kind of malfunction. Maybe there was fuel trapped in a line, slowly bleeding out. Maybe the purge hadn't done its job. Maybe my tired mind was exaggerating everything. I clung to those explanations like a drowning man clings to driftwood, but the smell returned. It was stronger this time, thicker, a mix of ash and something bitter, almost sweet in the wrong way like burned sugar laced with rot. It coated the back of my throat until I had to cough into my sleeve, my stomach tightening with nausea. I stepped toward the panel, desperate to reset the system, to shut everything down again. I flipped the switches in rapid succession. Power cut, flow checked, lockout engaged. By every measure, the furnace was dead. And yet, through the glass, the fire lived on. It didn't shrink this time. It didn't even falter. If anything, it grew brighter, glowing with a sickly intensity that made the chamber walls pulse orange. I felt the sweat bead on my forehead, drip down the back of my neck, soaking the collar of my shirt. The heat wasn't supposed to be this strong with the system off. It was as if the fire no longer cared about fuel or ignition. It was burning on something else. I pressed my hand flat against the glass. It was so hot it seared my skin in less than a second. I pulled back instinctively, a hiss of pain escaping my lips. The glass should have been warm, yes, but not blistering, not with everything powered down. That's when I noticed the sound. At first I thought it was just the crackle of fire, the usual hiss and pop of combustion. But as I listened, my blood ran cold. The noise wasn't random. It had cadence, rhythm. It sounded like breath. Not smooth, steady breath, but ragged, labored like someone fighting to fill their lungs on the other side of that glass. Each rise of flame came with a low whoosh, each fall with a faint rasp. My knees nearly buckled beneath me, and I had to grip the counter again just to stay upright. The fire wasn't just burning, it was breathing. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, trapped between terror and disbelief. Seconds? Minutes? Time felt warped in that room, stretched thin by the weight of heat and silence. The rational part of me wanted to run, to leave the chamber behind and call in a technician, anyone to witness this madness. But another part, a darker, heavier part, kept me rooted, because deep down, I felt that whatever was happening, it wasn't mechanical. It wasn't something another set of hands could fix. It was something else entirely. The flame flared suddenly, bright enough to paint the entire room in shifting orange light. I threw up a hand against the glare, but in that split-second burst, I thought I saw something in the heart of it. Not just fire, not just heat, a shape, a curve of a shoulder, the faint outline of a head turning, as though something inside had finally noticed me watching. I stumbled backwards so fast, I knocked over the stool beside me. It clattered across the floor, the sound unnaturally sharp in the thick air. My breath came fast, shallow, but the fire didn't waver. If anything, it seemed to swell, as though feeding on my fear. The gauges ticked higher still, mocking me. The controls stayed locked, unresponsive. And the fire burned on, as though it had never once been subject to my command. That was the moment I realized I wasn't in control anymore. The furnace, the flame, the heat, it had all slipped from my grasp. Something else was driving it now, something that didn't care about switches or levers or protocols. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't done with me yet. The gauges were lying to me. I knew that much, because no number on a dial could explain what I felt crawling over my skin and pressing down into my lungs. The temperature climbed beyond anything the shutdown system should have allowed. Yet the heat wasn't just numerical. It was invasive, like it had a weight of its own, thickening the air until every breath burned going in and scraped coming out. My shirt clung to my back, drenched through in minutes, my arms slick with sweat that made the clipboard in my hands slide uselessly to the floor. I had shut down the fuel lines, cut the ignition, engaged the lockout, but the fire in that chamber behaved as though it owed nothing to machinery, as if it had tapped into some reservoir I couldn't see, some source that wasn't fuel or gas or oxygen, but something deeper, older, less forgiving. I tried opening the small vent in the wall to let fresh air in, but even as I turned the crank, the atmosphere in the prep room thickened instead of clearing, the smell of burning taking on a density that seemed impossible. It wasn't just ash anymore, nor the acrid tang of scorched metal. It was darker, sweeter, almost oily, and it clung to the back of my tongue until I felt bile rise, forcing me to swallow hard to keep from gagging. I staggered back toward the door to the hallway, pressing my hand against the cool steel handle, and for a fleeting second, I considered throwing it open and leaving everything behind. Yet when I looked over my shoulder through the window, the sight of the fire pinned me where I stood. It was still moving, not wildly, but with intent, curling along the chamber walls, pulsing against the reinforced glass as if it were searching for a way out. There was no roar of combustion, no mechanical hiss, only the low rhythmic throb of something that was neither entirely natural nor entirely silent. That sound pressed against my eardrums, the way deep water pressure might. A presence more than a noise, and my body responded instinctively with a tremor that started in my fingertips and spread to my knees. I forced myself forward, one heavy step after another, until I stood again at the control panel, and my eyes fell to the displays. Every light was dead, every indicator flat, the panel utterly unresponsive. It might as well have been a museum piece for all the effect it had. And yet the room kept growing hotter. It was suffocating now, heat without flame on my side of the glass, a dry, punishing intensity that made every breath an effort, every blink sting with salt. I unbuttoned the top of my shirt, tugged at the collar for relief, but the air clung tighter, pressing against me as though the walls themselves were exhaling. My head throbbed in rhythm with my pulse, each beat sending waves of nausea rolling through my stomach. And when I wiped the sweat from my eyes, my hand came away, streaked with soot that shouldn't have been there. The ventilation was supposed to keep the prep room clean, scrub it of ash and odor, but the soot had bled through somehow, staining the walls with faint streaks like smoke fingers dragging downward from the ceiling. I rubbed at one with my knuckle, and the black smudge smeared across my skin, gritty, undeniable. That was when panic really began to take hold. Not the sharp, sudden kind that drives you into motion, but the slow, drowning sort that seeps into your bones, convincing you with every breath that you will not leave this room, not without a cost. I grabbed the phone mounted to the wall to call the director, or anyone, but when I pressed the receiver to my ear, there was nothing. Only a faint static hum, the kind that feels less like bad connection and more like interference, like another line is already in use somewhere far away. I slammed it back onto the cradle, my hand shaking, and turned toward the window again, because some part of me, some grim, masochistic instinct, needed to see. And what I saw made the heat inside me feel like ice. The fire no longer danced randomly. It surged in rhythm, brightening and dimming with the cadence of a heartbeat, as though the furnace itself had grown lungs and blood and will. Each pulse of light came with a subtle vibration beneath my boots, faint but real, a tremor I felt travel up my legs. My first thought, irrational but undeniable, was that the building itself was breathing along with it. My rational mind tried to push through, insisting on explanations expanding metal, air pockets, settling foundations, but the part of me that had been working with the dead long enough to respect silence knew that explanations were only scraps to keep me sane. The truth was there in the heat, in the smell, in the weight of the room. The fire wasn't just consuming what was left of the body inside. It was feeding on something else, something that didn't burn away with flesh or bone. I staggered back from the panel, clutching my stomach against the nausea, and nearly tripped over the stool I had knocked down earlier. The clang of its metal legs on the floor sounded muted, swallowed instantly by the heavy air, and I realized with dread that even sound itself seemed to falter here. It was like the room didn't want noise that didn't belong to the fire. I pressed my palms to my ears, trying to block the throb, the phantom heartbeat, but it was useless. It was inside me now, resonating through bone and marrow, impossible to shut out. My vision blurred at the edges, sweat stinging my eyes, but I couldn't allow myself to collapse, not yet. With one last surge of will, I forced myself toward the door, gripped the steel handle, and yanked it open, desperate for cool air. But what spilled in wasn't relief. The hallway outside was dark, cooler than the room, but heavy with the same sweetness of burnt sugar and rot, a smell that didn't belong anywhere except inside a furnace. My knees buckled, my chest heaved, but I stayed upright because some instinct told me that stepping into that hallway would not save me. The furnace behind me exhaled again, a wave of heat that prickled my skin as if unseen fingers had dragged themselves across my back. And I shut the door hard, leaning against it with every ounce of strength I had left. I stood there, shaking, realizing that the heat wasn't just physical anymore. It had become a presence, invisible but undeniable, pressing closer with every second, not consuming me with flame, but with proximity, as if it was testing how much of me could be burned away without ever setting me alight. I thought the worst of it had passed when I pressed my back to the steel door and forced myself to breathe, shallow and ragged, just enough to keep upright. But silence is never permanent in this place, and soon it was broken, not by the hum of machinery or the creak of the building settling, but by something far more deliberate. At first, it was nothing more than a faint clicking, like the sound of metal cooling after use, harmless, ordinary. I almost welcomed it, clinging to the hope that it was simple thermal contraction, that the strange pressure in the room had an explanation I could put on a log sheet. But the sound did not fade as metal does. Instead, it sharpened, multiplied, echoing in a staccato rhythm that seemed too purposeful to be random. Each snap rang from within the furnace itself, crisp as bones fracturing under strain, layered one upon the other until it became a chorus of cracking and splitting. I froze, listening, counting the intervals, realizing with a crawling dread that the pattern resembled more than coincidence. It beat in sync, with the throbbing pulse I had already felt through the soles of my boots, as though the chamber itself had found a way to speak through both vibration and sound. I told myself it was the casket, maybe, or remnants of bone splintering under heat, but I knew better. I had overseen hundreds of cremations, watched dozens of bodies reduced to ash and fragment, and never once had I heard a cadence so measured, so insistent. These weren't the random pops of expanding air or fracturing remains. They were deliberate, intentional, like fingers tapping against glass from the other side. I drew closer to the viewing window, against every instinct, and pressed my ear near the reinforced glass. The heat radiating off it was unbearable, enough to singe the hairs of my cheek, but I held there anyway, because I had to know. The cracks and snaps deepened as I leaned in, no longer brittle fractures, but heavy groans, like timbers bending under weight. And beneath them, low and almost lost, came a different sound entirely, a murmur. It was so faint I thought at first it was the blood rushing in my own ears from fear, but then it rose just slightly, weaving through the harsh groans, a muted whisper that didn't match the cadence of my breath or heartbeat. I pulled back fast, nearly stumbling over the stool again, but the sound followed me, carrying through the thick glass. Impossible, yet undeniable. It was speech. Not clear, not full words, but the rise and fall of tone, the cadence of someone speaking from deep underwater. I stood there, trembling, straining to catch a phrase, a syllable, anything I could anchor to reason. But the more I listened, the more it seemed the words twisted just beyond comprehension. The voice was layered, not singular, sometimes high and fragile, sometimes deep and guttural, as though more than one mouth spoke at once, all of them muffled by fire and smoke. The room seemed to close in around me then, every surface vibrating with that buried whisper, until even my bones felt complicit in the sound. I pressed my hands hard against my ears, desperate to block it out, but the noise grew louder within, as if it had bypassed the air entirely and found its way straight into me. I staggered back, slamming against the control panel, though its dead lights offered no comfort. The murmur pitched suddenly upward, breaking into what I swore were syllables, sharp consonants caught on fire. I thought I heard my name, though whether whispered or screamed, I couldn't say, and the sound of it clawed into my chest until I doubled over with nausea. I retched, but nothing came, only a bitter taste of soot rising at the back of my throat. The cracking grew louder now, a syncopated percussion against the whispers, building into something that no longer resembled an accident of combustion, but a performance, a communication. And then came the pounding. Once, twice, 3 times dull, heavy blows from inside the chamber that rattled the glass in its frame. I staggered back, terror clawing at every nerve, watching the reinforced pain shiver with each strike. There should have been nothing left inside, capable of movement, no flesh, no bone with force enough to strike. Yet the sound was clear, undeniable, each impact timed like a demand. My instincts screamed at me to run, to flee the building, and never look back. But my feet remained rooted, my body bound by the sickening compulsion to witness. I forced myself forward again, trembling, and peered through the small round window in the furnace door. The flames roared higher than before, their movement violent now, curling and lashing at the glass with a ferocity that looked less like fire and more like grasping hands. And within that chaos, shadows shifted, dark shapes outlined by orange and red, flickering in and out as if struggling to form. The whispers rose into groans, the groans into guttural screams, muffled by the walls of the chamber. And I could no longer convince myself they weren't voices. They were voices, layered, insistent, pressed against the threshold of the living world, and I was their only audience. The pounding came again, harder this time, reverberating through the entire prep room. Dust sifted down from the ceiling tiles. The stool rattled across the floor, and I staggered back, clutching my head, certain that one more blow would shatter the glass and unleash whatever pressed against it. My breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, the taste of metal on my tongue, my body slick with sweat, it chilled as quickly as it formed. And then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the sound stopped. No cracks, no whispers, no pounding, only the hiss of fire still burning without fuel and the violent thump of my own heart. I stood frozen in the silence that followed, every muscle taut, waiting for the next strike, the next voice, the next impossible sound. But nothing came. The chamber burned on, steady and defiant, as if mocking me for expecting relief. And in that silence, heavier than noise, I realized the truth that chilled me more than the heat could ever burn. The dead are not always silent, and fire does not always consume what it's given. Sometimes it stirs, sometimes it awakens, and sometimes it speaks only to those foolish enough to listen. I had told myself that the worst thing about this job was not the bodies, not the smell of chemicals or the unrelenting heat, but the silence that fills the hours between tasks, heavy enough to make you hear things you shouldn't. Tonight had already proven that silence could be worse than noise, that the dead could find ways to speak through fire and fracture. But what came next made me long for those disembodied whispers again, because once you see something with your own eyes, there is no comfort in denial, no shield of imagination to hide behind. Once you see, you cannot unsee. It began in the pause after the pounding stopped, when the air was so still, it felt like the whole building was holding its breath with me. My skin prickled as if I were standing before a storm, waiting for the lightning to split the sky. The flames inside the chamber had calmed, though calm was not the right word. They had steadied, collected, no longer lashing wildly against the glass, but pulling themselves inward, folding into a tighter, more deliberate dance. The color shifted too, from scattered orange and yellow to a deeper, darker core of red that pulsed as though it had found rhythm again, as though it had chosen a heart to beat with. I should have turned away. I knew that, should have bolted for the exit and left the fire to its impossible games. But I couldn't. My eyes were fixed on that window, drawn by some sick compulsion, by the certainty that if I looked away, I would miss what was coming next, and that somehow it mattered that I witness it. The glass fogged briefly, though there was no moisture left in the room, no condensation in the furnace, only a smear of shadow that spread across the surface. And then, as though aligning itself out of smoke and light, the flames parted and something emerged. Not a body, not flesh, not anything tangible, but the unmistakable outline of a figure. At first it was faint, almost a trick of reflection, like the ghostly image of my own stance caught in the curve of the glass. But it moved differently than I did. It leaned forward while I remained rigid. It tilted its head to a side, mine did not. The fire licked around it, illuminating shoulders, arms, the curve of a head, until the silhouette became undeniable. There was someone inside. I stumbled back a step, my breath caught somewhere between a gasp and a choke, yet I couldn't look away. The shape was motionless, suspended in the furious heat, its edges flickering with the dance of the flames, but never dispersing. It stood as though pressed against the far wall of the chamber, too solid to be smoke, too defined to be an illusion of fire. I felt my knees weaken, my stomach hollow out, because recognition was forming where it had no right to exist. The figure's posture was unmistakably human, but worse, it was unmistakably aware. The tilt of the head was not random. It was watching me. Seconds stretched like hours. The furnace should have been devouring what little remained, scattering the body to ash, but in that moment, it was more like a stage. The glass a screen, and I the only audience to a performance I was never meant to see. I thought I saw an arm lift, the faintest suggestion of fingers reaching, but whether it was the flames shaping themselves or some truth I could not deny, I didn't know. My chest constricted as though invisible hands had wrapped around me, pressing me closer, forcing me to witness every detail of that fiery apparition. Then came the eyes, or what passed for them. The silhouette had no features at first, just the stark outline, but gradually within the head-shaped blur of fire, two hollows formed. Not bright like the flames, not reflective like glass, but dark, impossibly dark, voids in the light. They fixed on me, unblinking, unwavering, as though the furnace itself had opened windows into something that looked back. My throat tightened. I tried to swallow and couldn't. The whispers I had heard earlier seemed to return, faint and distorted, curling around the edges of the silence. They didn't come from my ears this time, but from within, as if seeing had unlocked their entry point deeper inside me. I wanted to scream, to curse, to run, but all I managed was a strangled sound that barely left my lips. My feet felt cemented to the floor. My fingers clawed at the air in front of me, as though I could push the image back into the flames. The silhouette didn't move closer, didn't press against the glass, but the weight of its gaze did, filling every inch of space between us, until the room itself seemed to buckle under its presence. I knew, in some primal marrow-deep way, that if it ever crossed the barrier of that glass, there would be nothing left of me to write in a log, no words to explain what had been seen. And then, mercifully or cruelly, it flickered. The flames rose high, obscuring the figure, and for a moment I thought it was gone. Nothing but the afterimage of terror etched onto my vision. But just as relief brushed the edge of me, the silhouette sharpened once more. Closer this time, its head tilted further, as though mocking my hope. My breath tore out of me, loud and ragged, and in that sound the glass trembled with condensation again, as though it too had exhaled. That was the moment I understood was not a trick of the fire. It was not a hallucination born of exhaustion or heat stroke. Something had taken shape inside that chamber, and it had chosen to reveal itself. The silence that followed was unbearable, broken only by the hum of the furnace and the pulse in my skull. And then, with a final convulsion of flame, the silhouette dissolved, scattering back into chaos, nothing left but the random sway of fire. But the impression of its form, of those impossible dark eyes, burned hotter than the chamber itself, seared into me. I stumbled backward until my spine hit the far wall, pressing myself there as if I could vanish into it, shaking uncontrollably, my eyes fixed on the now empty window. I knew, with a clarity sharper than any I'd felt before, that I had seen something the living were not meant to see. Not a ghost, not a hallucination, but a residue of will so strong it refused to be burned away. The dead man's body was ash now, but whatever had looked at me through the flames was not ash. It was something else, something that lingered, resisting the passage fire was supposed to grant. I stayed pinned against that wall for long minutes, until the flames began to fade back to their natural rhythm, until the furnace was once again only a furnace. But even then, even with the glass empty and the fire returning to silence, I could feel it, that gaze, that awareness, and I knew I would never again trust the lie that the fire consumes everything it touches. I don't remember moving away from the glass, not in any conscious way, but at some point, my back was pressed hard against the far wall of the crematorium. My fingers splayed against the cinder block, as though I could steady the building itself. My pulse was hammering loud enough to drown the hum of the furnace, and my breath came in shallow bursts that did nothing to ease the heaviness in my chest. For a moment, maybe several minutes, I couldn't tell. I just stood there, pinned in place, staring at the furnace window, waiting for that shape to return, for those hollow eyes to find me again. But the fire had returned to chaos, to the meaningless swirl of orange and red, and the silhouette had vanished as though it had never been there at all. I should have taken comfort in that, but comfort was a word that had lost meaning. What I felt instead was the slow creeping certainty that if I stayed frozen in that corner long enough, the fire would find another way to show me what it wanted me to see, and I couldn't endure that again. Something had to give. My body was already trembling with the demand to act, any action, even if it was the wrong one. That's what fear does. It convinces you that standing still is fatal, that survival lies only in movement. I forced myself to peel off the wall, each step toward the furnace heavy, reluctant, like walking through water. My hands shook as I reached for the control panel, though in truth there was little left to control. The cycle had run its course long before, The systems disengaged as they were supposed to, and yet the fire still raged with a stubbornness that mocked the machinery. I stared at the panel, at the dull glow of the inactive switches, and knew the truth. The furnace wasn't listening anymore. The buttons were just props, and I was the fool clinging to them for reassurance. I considered calling anyone. The director, the night guard, a technician, even the police. But what would I say? That the fire wouldn't go out? That I'd seen a man-shaped shadow staring at me from the flames? I could already hear the silence on the other end of the line. Could imagine the explanations they would offer: heat distortion, exhaustion, hallucination. Maybe they would even send someone down to check, but by the time they arrived, the flames would be gone, the glass would be empty, and I would be left looking like a man who had broken under the pressure of solitude and death. And maybe they'd be right. Maybe I was breaking. But whatever sanity remained in me insisted that what I had seen was real, and there was nothing anyone else could do about it. So I chose the only path left. I would wait. I would not touch the controls again, not attempt to fight the fire into submission, not try to explain or record what had happened. I would simply let it burn itself out, however long that took, and pray that when the flames finally died, they would take the thing I had seen with them. I sank into the old metal chair in the corner of the room, the one I usually used to fill out paperwork during cycles, and clasped my hands together to still their shaking. The air was unbearably hot, thick with the acrid sting of smoke that shouldn't have been there, but I forced myself to stay. I fixed my eyes not on the glass, but on the floor, watching the dance of shadow across the tiles as the fire pulsed behind me. The minutes crawled. Every creak of the building, every faint hiss from the furnace made me flinch. At times I thought I heard movement again inside the chamber, the faint scrape or shift of weight, but I didn't lift my eyes. I couldn't bear to see if something else was waiting for me. I told myself again and again, just wait, the fire will end, the night will end, you will walk out of here alive. It became a chant, a mantra I whispered under my breath, the words dissolving into the air before they could even form fully, but it was the only tether I had left. Eventually, after an hour, or maybe two, though it felt like a lifetime, the flames began to weaken. I could sense it even without looking, the way the heat lessened slightly, the air becoming more breathable. The roar of combustion dulled to a low hum, and the shadows on the floor lost their violent dance, settling into stillness. My chest loosened fraction by fraction as the realization sank in. It was ending. The fire, unnatural as it had been, was finally giving way. When I did dare to lift my head and glance at the glass, the inside of the chamber was obscured with ash and smoke, but no shapes formed, no eyes watched. The silhouette, whatever it had been, was gone. Relief should have come then, but what I felt instead was a hollow exhaustion, the kind that digs deep into your bones. I didn't celebrate, didn't sigh or thank any god. I simply sat there in silence, letting the sweat dry on my skin, letting my heartbeat find a rhythm again. When the last of the flames had died to embers, and even those embers crumbled into ash, I rose from the chair and went to the logbook on the side table. My hand hovered above the pen for a long while, unsure what to write. There was no column for what had happened, no space in the neat rows of time and temperature for shadows in the fire. In the end, I wrote only the basics. Cycle completed, remains reduced, ash, furnace shut down. My handwriting was shaky, uneven, but it would pass. No one would ever know what I had seen except me. But that was enough. It would live with me, carved into the dark corners of memory where no logbook could reach. And as I shut the ledger and turned off the lights, I knew one thing with certainty. I had not chosen to end the fire. The fire had chosen to end itself. I was only the witness, the keeper of its secret, the man who had sat in the heat and waited while something beyond understanding burned itself into my mind. And that waiting, that helpless endurance, felt like the only decision I had ever truly made in this place. When the last of the fire was gone, when only silence and the faint odor of smoke lingered in the air, I felt the weight of the night pressed down heavier than it had during the height of the flames. The room was quiet now, the kind of quiet that should have brought relief, but instead, it carried a thickness, an almost tangible substance that settled into my lungs, as though the air itself was aware of what had transpired. I moved slowly, with the care of a man who didn't trust the ground beneath his feet to hold him steady. Each step deliberate, each breath cautious, as if too sudden a movement might stir something I wanted left undisturbed. At the logbook I stood motionless for a long while, the pen cold and thin between my fingers, staring down at the blank line, awaiting my account of the night. There was no field for what I had seen, no proper entry for a flame that rekindled itself against every control, no category for a silhouette staring back from a fire that should have been lifeless. The book demanded facts time, temperature, identification, outcome, and all I had were impressions, fragments, memories I doubted even I would believe come morning. In the end, I did what I had always done. I wrote the bare minimum. Cycle complete. Remains processed. Furnace shut down. The words were stiff, bloodless, a reflection not of what had happened, but of what could be safely spoken aloud. I closed the book with more force than I intended, the clap of it against the table sharp enough to echo, and the sound startled me. That's when I realized just how frayed my nerves were, how deeply the night had carved itself into me. I could not shake the image of the fire roaring back to life, nor the figure that had stood within it. It had not been smoke, nor trick of heat, nor the exhaustion of a long shift. It had been there, and though I had watched the fire die, though I had seen only ash left behind, the presence of that figure clung to me as though it had stepped out of the furnace and followed me into the silence. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I had been too tired. Maybe fear had painted shadows where none existed, but the arguments were hollow. Deep down, I knew what I had witnessed was not born of my mind alone. I busied myself with the closing tasks, shutting down the lights, securing the locks, aligning tools on their shelves with mechanical precision. It was ritual more than necessity, the kind of ritual you fall into when the mind is too raw to think freely. Every action was a prayer for normalcy. Stack the trays, wipe the counter, fold the cloth, close the cabinet. Yet no matter how tightly I clung to those rituals, the thought gnawed at me, the one truth that could not be catalogued away. The fire had burned beyond its purpose. It had not only consumed flesh and bone, it had held something else within it, something that resisted being erased. By the time I stepped outside, the night air hit me like a benediction, cool and damp against skin still flushed with the memory of heat. I stood under the dark sky for a long while, breathing deeply, watching the faint halo of moonlight spread across the gravel lot. The building loomed behind me, silent now, but silence no longer meant peace. Silence had become another weight, another reminder of how fragile the line between routine and the uncanny truly was. I thought of the man whose body I had delivered to the flames, a man with no family, no name spoken beyond paperwork, no mourners waiting to claim his ashes, and I wondered if perhaps that absence was the very thing that had held him here. Maybe the fire had not been stubborn in its mechanics, but in its burden, carrying not just matter but memory, refusing to let go because no one else would. It is a dangerous thing to work too long around the dead, because eventually you begin to think about what lingers. Not just the cells, the tissues, the fragments of bone that survive the furnace, but the invisible parts, the pieces of a life that resist reduction. We like to believe fire is final, absolute, a purifier that leaves nothing behind but dust. But that night taught me otherwise. That night, I learned that flame can be just as deceitful as silence, that it can hide within itself not only destruction but presence, intention, the last trace of a will not yet ready to yield. I did not tell anyone what happened. Not then, not later, not ever in full detail. I gave them the paperwork they needed. I offered the mechanical answers they expected, and I kept the truth locked inside me, like an ember that refuses to die. Yet sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see the furnace glass flare bright, still glimpse that silhouette standing as though the fire had not claimed him at all. And in those moments, I am reminded that death is not always surrender, that the line between burning and being consumed is not as certain as we like to think. So I return, night after night, to this place where the living end and the fire takes what is left, and I tell myself it is routine, it is work, it is nothing more. But in the hollow hours, when the world is quietest, I know better. I know that sometimes the fire does not consume all that it touches. Sometimes it burns through flesh, but leaves behind something raw and unyielding, something that stares back through the glass as if to say, not yet, not entirely. And as I walked away from that furnace on that night, with the smell of smoke still clinging to my clothes and the silence pressing heavy around me, one thought kept repeating in my mind, steady and cold as the ashes I left behind. Sometimes it feels like the fire doesn't just consume the body, it consumes what still refuses to leave. Story 2. It was late afternoon when they arrived, quiet as the shadows that lengthened across the parking lot outside the crematorium. Families never came in loudly, but there was something different about this group, something that suggested more than grief. It was resignation, perhaps, or simply exhaustion that had worn them down until even their mourning came without sound. A woman in her early 40s, her black coat buttoned tightly to her throat, despite the warmth of the day, walked in first, followed by two younger men who moved like they had been told where to stand and how to move, but hadn't really thought about it themselves. They were not the sobbing kind of family, not the kind that crumbled in the waiting room or clutched each other's hands. They were still steady, the sort of mourners who looked like they had already cried all their tears in private and had come here now only to collect what remained and return to whatever silence waited at home. The man they had come for was named Henry Mather, 62 years old, retired machinist, widowed for nearly a decade. His life, according to the file, had been unremarkable in most ways. No scandals, no lingering court cases, no strange medical history that would demand extra paperwork. A stroke, quick and final, had taken him while he sat in his recliner with the television buzzing faintly in the background. His neighbor found him hours later. Death certificates had been signed, the paperwork completed, and now the family stood across from me at the service desk, their voices low as they asked for what the crematorium promised in tidy language, the return of cremated remains. But there was no tidiness in their faces, not really. There was that thin edge of discomfort, the same one I saw in almost every family. It wasn't the grief alone, it was the strangeness of the request itself. What does it mean, truly, to walk into a building and ask for the body of your father, or brother, or husband to be turned into ash and handed back in a vessel you can carry under one arm? They never said it out loud, but I could see the question lingering at the corners of their eyes. Do you really get all of him back? And if you do, is it still him? The woman spoke for all of them. Her voice was steady, rehearsed, as though she had practiced these words before standing in front of me. We'd like to take his ashes. Today, if possible. I nodded, of course. That was the process. But in the quiet between her words, I heard the weight of them, the way ashes landed on her tongue like something foreign, something she wasn't sure she wanted to taste. The younger of the two men shifted uncomfortably at her side, glancing at the wall clock, and I knew immediately that he was the one who wanted to get this over with quickly. There was always someone who couldn't bear the waiting, the lingering in this place of cold metal and low hums. I told them it would take some time, that the process was precise and could not be rushed, and the older of the two men, perhaps the deceased's brother, gave a short nod of understanding. He was the practical one, the one who had probably filled out the forms, chosen the urn, made the arrangements while the others folded into themselves. Every family had its roles, and I had become practiced at recognizing them within minutes. The organizer, the mourner, the restless one who wanted out. They didn't ask to see the process. Most families didn't. The crematory was not a place of ritual for them. It was a transaction, an exchange. They gave us the body. We returned to them what remained. That was enough. They lingered in the quiet reception area, only briefly, speaking in whispers among themselves before retreating to the benches outside, leaving me with the file, the responsibility, and the familiar hum of the machinery that waited behind the steel door at the end of the hall. I carried Henry Mather's file with me as I walked back, flipping through the thin folder, the sparse history. He wasn't a man of implants or prosthetics, no pacemaker, no unusual hardware left behind by a surgeon's hand. His body, the notes told me, was ordinary flesh and bone, the kind that would burn cleanly, predictably, leaving only the brittle fragments that could be sifted down to the gray. Fine consistency families expected when they carried their loved ones home in an urn. It was, by all accounts, the simplest kind of case. But even as I read the words, unremarkable medical history, and no complications anticipated, I felt something, a kind of unease that slipped quietly into the room with me. Perhaps it was nothing more than the tone of the family, the stillness that clung to them like fog, the way they had spoken as though this were a formality rather than a farewell. Or perhaps it was the silence itself, thicker that day, heavier, the kind that seems to hang just above your head, pressing down as though waiting to fall. I told myself it was imagination. After all, the crematorium was built on silence. That was its nature. Still, I caught myself glancing once toward the furnace door, though it had not yet been opened, as though something behind that thick steel plate had already begun to stir. I pushed the thought away and returned to the routine. Routine was what mattered here. Routine kept you sane. Routine kept the world of the living separate from the strange places the dead sometimes dragged you toward. By the time I finished logging Henry Mather's case into the system, the family had stepped back inside briefly. They didn't approach the counter this time, only looked at me from across the room, their faces pale, expectant. I offered them the practiced nod, the same one I had given hundreds of families before them, the one that meant everything was proceeding as it should. They left again soon after, the door whispering shut behind them, leaving me alone with the weight of their request. I have always thought it strange, the way grief makes people quiet. It presses down on them, pulls their voices inward, makes them whisper in places where no one is sleeping, no one needs the hush. And yet, that day, their silence seemed more than grief. It seemed like a kind of fear, and as I carried the file into the back and set it beside the furnace door, I couldn't shake the feeling that what they had asked me for, the ashes of Henry Mather, would not be as simple to return as they believed. The first step in any cremation, no matter how routine, is preparation, and preparation is everything. Without it, the whole process collapses into chaos. Mistakes are made, records are broken, and the dignity of the dead is compromised. That's why, in this line of work, you cling to procedure the way a drowning man clings to a piece of driftwood. It isn't just about paperwork or switches or metal trays. It's about order. Order is the only defense against the weight of death pressing down on you every day, the only way to keep yourself steady in a building where silence sits heavier than stone. I began as I always did, walking through the back corridor toward the furnace chamber, the file tucked neatly under my arm. Henry Mather, 62, stroke, no complications. The words circled in my mind like a mantra. This would be straightforward, predictable. I reminded myself of that as I pushed the metal door open and stepped into the preparation room. The chamber was exactly as it always was, sterile, metallic, humming faintly with the low vibration of machinery in standby. Stainless steel tables gleamed under the overhead lights, spotless, waiting for the next body. The furnace loomed at the far wall, its thick steel door bolted shut, its temperature gauges idle. To some, it might have looked like nothing more than equipment, cold and functional. But to me, after years of working here, it always carried a different presence. It wasn't just a machine. It was a threshold. I logged Henry's name into the preparation sheet, checking his identification tag against the paperwork once more. Because that's what we do. We check, double-check, and check again. Mistakes in a crematorium are not allowed. Families expect certainty, and certainty is the only gift we can give them after loss. His tag matched, his file matched, and so I moved on to the casket. It wasn't an elaborate one, just a simple container made for cremation, plywood lined with a combustible interior. Families often didn't know that most cremations didn't involve the caskets you see at funerals. The polished mahogany, the velvet lining, those were for show. For the fire, something simple was required, functional, disposable. I slid Henry's container onto the metal rollers, positioning it in line with the furnace door, and paused for a moment to make sure the angles were exact. Even a small misalignment could cause problems once the chamber roared to life. The tools of the trade surrounded me, each in its place, each one familiar. The rake for moving remains, the cooling tray, the brushes and scoops for sifting the ash when the fire had done its work. I had handled them so many times that my hands knew their weight by instinct. Everything in this room was designed for efficiency, for precision. Nothing was left to chance. That was the only way to keep the human element, the fragility of grief, the trembling of memory, from overwhelming the worker tasked with turning bodies into what families call remains. I checked the furnace next, running my hand across the control panel, inspecting the gauges, flipping each switch in the sequence, drilled into me from the first day I was trained. Door seals? Secure. Ash pan? Cleared. Airflow? Calibrated. Gas supply? Stable. I watched the indicator lights blink steadily, their rhythm like a heartbeat, a quiet reassurance that everything was functioning as it should. Routine. This was all routine. And yet, even as I repeated each step with the care of someone who knows the smallest slip can undo everything, I felt the weight of Henry's family's silence pressing at the edges of my mind. The way they had looked at me, steady but uneasy, returned as I worked. Most families left their grief behind in sobs or whispered prayers, but theirs had been quieter, almost fearful, as if they wanted this done not only to honor their dead, but to be rid of something. I shook the thought away. My job wasn't to interpret emotions. My job was the fire. When I wheeled Henry's container forward, aligning it with the furnace door, I paused as I always did. This was not ritual, not exactly, but a habit. A moment of stillness before the fire. I placed my hand lightly on the lid of the container, the plywood cool under my glove, and thought of him. Not long, never more than a breath, but long enough to remind myself that this was not just a process, not just paperwork. A man had lived here. A man had died here, and now he would be fire and ash. I checked the logbook again, verifying the identification number stamped onto the file, then entered it into the furnace's digital panel. The number flickered across the screen, marking Henry's passage into the system. Once the button was pressed, once the chamber roared to life, there would be no reversing it. The fire would claim him entirely, leaving behind only fragments. That was the nature of this work, finality, sealed in steel. Before I ignited the chamber, I made one last circuit of the room, scanning for anything out of place. It was second nature by now, almost a compulsion. The cooling trays stood neatly stacked. The brushes were clean, hung in their proper slots. The gauges on the secondary chamber glowed steadily. Everything was exactly as it should be. And yet, as I stood there, the silence pressed against my ears more heavily than usual, like the whole building was holding its breath. I reminded myself again of the words stamped into Henry's file. Unremarkable. There would be nothing unusual here. Just another man carried into the fire, another family waiting for an urn to bring home. Routine. Predictable. And so, with the checklist complete, I reached for the ignition switch, feeling the cool press of the button under my gloved fingertip. A familiar sound rose in anticipation, the low hiss of gas filling the chamber, the soft mechanical thud as valves opened. The furnace waited, its silence poised on the edge of transformation. I took a single breath, steady and controlled, before pressing the switch that would summon the flames. There is always a moment before the fire begins, when the weight of the living is heavier than the dead. That moment had arrived as Henry's family lingered in the quiet space just beyond the preparation room. They hadn't wanted a ceremony. No flowers, no speeches, no priest or pastor to guide them through words they didn't believe would change anything. They only asked for a chance to stand silently beside the container that held their husband, their father, their brother, one last time. It was not unusual. Families grieve in different ways. Some fill the chapel with music and eulogies. Others choose silence. But there was something about their silence that stayed with me, even as I stepped aside to give them room. It wasn't peaceful, not the kind of quiet that carries a gentle acceptance. It was brittle, sharp, as though every unspoken word was threatening to shatter into pieces at their feet. The eldest daughter approached first, her hand trembling as she rested it against the plywood lid of the cremation container. She didn't cry. Her eyes were dry, her face tight, as though she was holding back something larger than tears. The younger son stood behind her, his hands jammed deep into his jacket pockets, shoulders hunched forward, his lips pressed into a thin line. Their mother, the widow, remained at the doorframe, her face pale, her fingers clutching the strap of her handbag so tightly the leather creaked. She didn't step forward, not once. She only looked at the container as though it were something both sacred and dangerous, something she needed to acknowledge but could not approach. I had seen grief in every shape, violent sobbing that shook the body until it collapsed, quiet resignation that turned people into stone, desperate clinging to the casket as though refusing to let go could hold back the inevitable. But this was different. Their grief had no outlet. It sat in the room like a weight, pressing down on all of us, suffocating, unshed. I stood at the edge of the chamber, hands folded, eyes lowered, giving them space. It was not my place to intrude. They spoke no words of farewell, no whispered prayers or promises. They simply stood there, their gazes fixed on the simple container that was about to carry Henry into the furnace. A daughter's hand lingered on the lid, her thumb tracing the grain of the wood as if memorizing the pattern, before she finally stepped back. The son shifted his weight, glanced once at his mother, then at me, as if to confirm that it was done, that there was nothing more to say. The widow's grip on her handbag tightened once more, and then she nodded, a small, sharp motion that was more dismissal than blessing. It was over as quickly as it had begun. They turned away, their footsteps echoing hollowly down the corridor as they left the preparation room behind. No tears, no embraces, no voices breaking under the weight of farewell. Just silence, and then the faint sound of the outer door shutting, leaving me alone again with the dead. That is the moment when the true weight of this job presses in. Because once the family walks away, the burden falls entirely onto your shoulders. Their trust, their silence, their unspoken expectations, they hand it all to you without a word, and you are left to carry it into the fire. No one sees what happens beyond that threshold. They do not want to. They want only the end result, an urn, sealed and certain, returned to their hands with a name etched into its surface. The process itself is left to me, to the steel, to the fire. I returned to the chamber, standing beside Henry's container. It looked no different than any other, plain and unremarkable, but I felt the residue of their silence clinging to it. I knew the fire didn't care. Fire consumes without judgment. But still, I paused. This was the final farewell, not for them, for me. A small moment of acknowledgement before procedure erased what little humanity still clung to the edges of the task. I reached out and placed my hand flat on the lid once more, a gesture I had made hundreds of times before. The plywood was cool beneath my palm, the grain rough through the thin glove. I closed my eyes and let the silence stretch, thinking of the man inside. I didn't know Henry beyond the file, beyond the brief description that reduced his life to dates and cause of death. But I knew he had been someone. He had laughed once, spoken, perhaps even sung. He had moved through rooms filled with people who recognized his face, his voice, his presence. And now he was here, reduced to stillness, about to become something that could fit in the palms of his family's hands. It is easy to lose that perspective in this work, easy to forget that each name in the logbook Each container rolled into the chamber represents a life once lived in all its chaos and imperfection. That is why I pause, not out of superstition, not out of fear, but out of necessity. Because if you don't remind yourself of the humanity in front of you, you become nothing more than a cog in a machine, and the weight of the silence will consume you. When I finally pulled my hand back, the room felt heavier, as though the air itself had absorbed the family's silence and held it there. I exhaled slowly, reached for the control panel, and prepared myself for the fire. The farewell was over. The living had left. It was time for the dead to meet the furnace. The room always changes the moment the furnace awakens. The silence that had weighed on me after the family's departure gave way to a new kind of sound, one that filled every corner of the chamber until there was no space left for thought. The click of the ignition, the sudden rush of gas, and then the low roar as the flames caught. It was like a breath exhaled by something vast and ancient. The furnace did not just burn. It consumed, it devoured, it filled the sterile air with a reminder of its absolute power. No matter how many times I had stood in front of that fire, the sound of it always felt alive, not mechanical, not predictable, but something untamed harnessed for a purpose we pretended to control. The chamber glowed faintly orange, light seeping through the reinforced glass as the temperature climbed. I knew the rhythm of it well. There is a process, one that does not change. Minutes stretch, the heat builds, the wooden container succumbs first, collapsing into blackened fragments before disintegrating into ash. The body follows, piece by piece, the fire doing the work of unmaking what time had already begun. The sounds that follow are familiar to me: pops, cracks, the brittle crumble of bone under heat. None of it ever grows comfortable, but over the years, it becomes something you anticipate, something expected. Like the rhythm of a heart you know will one day stop, but still beats with a pattern that reassures. I watched the gauges, the steady rise of temperature, the hiss of gas feeding the flames. Nothing unusual, nothing that broke the pattern. From behind the glass, the fire moved in waves, rolling and folding over itself in the controlled chaos of combustion. Shadows bent strangely, stretching across the chamber walls as the furnace worked. I could feel the heat radiating even through the protective layers between us, a pressure that settled against my chest and face, reminding me of how close I stood to something that would incinerate me in seconds if given the chance. It was a truth I carried with me every shift. Fire does not discriminate. It has no sense of mercy, no understanding of the line between its work and ours. Time passes differently in front of the furnace. Minutes seem to dissolve, swallowed up by the constancy of the roar. My eyes moved back and forth between the glass and the panel, ensuring everything was proceeding as it should. Routine is what anchors you in those moments, what keeps the strangeness of the task from unraveling you. There is no room for hesitation, no room for doubt. The fire will do its work whether you are ready or not. As the process moved forward, I leaned back against the wall, letting the sound of the fire become the only thing in the room. It is a paradox, how noise can become silence if it is constant enough. The roar flattened into a hum in my mind, and in that hum, thoughts wandered. I remembered the family, the way they had stood in brittle silence, the way the widow had clutched her handbag like it was the only thing tethering her to the floor. I wondered if they had thought of the fire as I did, if they imagined it not as destruction, but as a kind of keeper, a devourer that transformed their grief into something they could carry. The chamber itself gave no sign of what it held inside. Through the reinforced glass, all I could see were the movements of flame, restless and hungry. The rest was hidden, obscured by fire and heat, but I knew what was happening. I could picture it in my mind as clearly as if I were standing inside. The reduction of a man to ash and fragments. The erasure of features, of details, until nothing remained that could be recognized as human. It was clinical, mechanical, and yet always layered with something heavier. Because no matter how you frame it, you are watching the unmaking of a life's vessel, the fire drawing its final line across the body's existence. I adjusted the controls slightly, ensuring the airflow was steady, the temperature maintained. A small task, mechanical and detached, but even as my hand moved over the switches, I felt the pull of the flames. They held the room in thrall, demanding attention, commanding silence. That was the truth of the work. You could never look away for long. Even if the gauges told you all was well, even if procedure dictated no surprises, something in you always knew better. Fire is not predictable. It can be guided, but never truly controlled. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour, and the rhythm remained steady. There were no alarms, no irregularities. The fire did what it always did, devouring in silence, roaring in constancy. And yet, even in its familiarity, I could not shake the feeling that the room had shifted. It wasn't visible, not in the gauges, not in the glow behind the glass, but in the air itself. Heavier somehow, thicker, as though the fire was not just burning, but watching. It was absurd, of course, a projection of long nights and tired eyes. But still, the thought lodged itself in my mind and would not leave. When the process reached its end stages, the roar softened, the temperature began its slow descent. The fire was withdrawing, leaving behind silence once more, though not the same silence that had existed before. This one was sharper, cut through with echoes of the flames. I stepped forward, watching as the last tongues of fire curled back into embers, fading into the recesses of the furnace. The chamber would soon cool enough to allow collection, the final step in the process. Another man reduced to ash, another family awaiting an urn. Everything about it had been ordinary, routine, expected. And yet, standing there, as the last flickers died, I felt the air in the chamber hold on to something unseen, something unburned. It was nothing I could name, nothing I could prove, only the faint impression that the fire had done more than consume. It had carried something with it, something that had not let go even as the body surrendered. I told myself it was fatigue, imagination. But in that moment, as the furnace cooled, I could not fully believe my own reassurance. The fire's work was done, but its echo lingered, heavy, as though the chamber was reluctant to release what it had taken in. When the furnace finally cooled to the point where the chamber could be opened, I followed the familiar ritual, one I had repeated countless times over the years, each movement ingrained into muscle memory, each step both technical and reverent. The fire's roar had faded, leaving behind only the faint hum of cooling metal and the sterile quiet of the room. Silence after fire always felt sharper, heavier, as if the air itself had to recalibrate. I waited longer than usual, not because the gauges demanded it, but because something in me hesitated, though I could not have explained why. At last, I turned the latch and opened the heavy door, the heat still spilling out in a wave that pushed against my face and chest. I stood still for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to what remained inside. Ordinarily, there is a predictability to what you find after cremation. The fire reduces the body to bone fragments, brittle and pale, scattered among the ashes of the coffin, and whatever small personal traces endure the heat. There is always a sameness to it, a clinical consistency that reassures you the process is complete. But as I peered into the chamber, a flicker of unease stirred in me before I had even begun to collect the remains. The volume of material seemed greater than it should have been, a mound of pale fragments and ash that appeared denser, heavier, as though the fire had multiplied what it was meant to diminish. It was not immediately obvious, not traumatic, but to someone who had stood at this door hundreds of times, the difference was undeniable. I reached in with the tools, the long-handled brush and metal pan, and began the slow work of gathering the remains. At first, it was routine, the sweep of bone fragments into the tray, the shift of ash falling like gray powder around the edges. But with each stroke, the weight increased. The bones did not crumble as easily as expected, some pieces holding their shape more stubbornly, heavier in my gloved hands than they should have been. I told myself it was nothing unusual, sometimes differences in bone density, sometimes variations in the fire's efficiency, but the rational explanations felt thin, like paper stretched over something heavier beneath. Then I saw the first glint, a shard of dull metal, small and jagged, buried among the pale ash. At first, I thought of surgical implants, screws or plates left behind after the fire consumed the flesh. I had seen them before, remnants of medical work that survived where the body did not, but this one was different. Its edges were uneven, twisted, not shaped by precision or design. I lifted it carefully, turning it in my gloved palm, and the weight of it surprised me. Too heavy for its size, its surface rough, almost scorched in a way that seemed older than the fire I had just witnessed. I set it aside, rushing deeper into the pile. More fragments followed, metallic and strange, each one unique, none resembling the standard remnants of surgical hardware. They were irregular shapes, sharp in places, warped in others, and each carried that same inexplicable weight, as though they did not belong to this chamber, or to the body that had lain within it. The more I found, the more the unease grew. The ashes were not merely ashes. The fragments were scattered throughout, as though woven into the remains themselves, inseparable from what the fire had left behind. The air felt heavier as I worked, the sterile hum of the room pressing down on me with new intensity. My gloves were dusted with gray powder, fine as flour, clinging in places where I had brushed too close. It left a texture that felt wrong against the fabric, as though it resisted removal, as though it wanted to remain. I shook my hands sharply, but the film persisted, a faint shimmer of ash clinging even as I continued to gather the rest. By the time the chamber was nearly clear, the tray before me was fuller than it should have been, heavier than I expected. I had handled enough urns to know what weight to anticipate, and this was more. Not dramatically so, but unmistakably beyond the ordinary, beyond what one man's remains should account for. I glanced at the collection pan, the mixture of pale fragments and gray dust, and the strange metallic shards gleaming faintly within. It was not right. The fire had done its work, and yet what it left behind was too much, as though it had unearthed something hidden rather than reduced something to nothing. I paused, standing there with the tools in hand, staring at the tray as if it might rearrange itself into sense if I gave it long enough. But nothing shifted. The fragments remained heavy and out of place, mingled with ash that clung too tightly, bones that resisted crumbling as they should. I told myself again that there were explanations, implants, variations in burn time, anomalies in composition. Yet even as I tried to steady my thoughts, I knew better. This was not the residue of procedure. It was something else, something I could not name, something the fire had drawn out rather than consumed. The silence of the room pressed harder now, as though the fire's absence had left a void that the remains themselves were filling. I set the tools aside, wiping the thin film of ash from my gloves onto a rag, but the texture lingered, gritty and unyielding. I stared once more into the tray, at the fragments that seemed to defy explanation, and felt the first true edge of dread cut through the practiced calm of routine. Something about these ashes was not right. Something about them suggested that the fire had not finished its work, or perhaps that it had uncovered something it was never meant to reveal. And standing there, surrounded by silence, staring down at the remains of what should have been nothing more than dust, I realized I was holding more than a man's ashes. I was holding a secret the fire itself had failed to destroy. The longer I stared at the fragments, the heavier they seemed to become, not only in my hands, but in the air itself, as though their presence altered the balance of the room. It was not just the physical density of the metal that unsettled me, though that alone was wrong, each shard pressing down with a disproportionate gravity that made even my gloved palm ache after holding one too long. It was the way they carried themselves, silent yet commanding, demanding recognition in a space that should have been reserved for ash, bone, and nothing more. I had handled surgical implants countless times before hip replacements, screws, plates, even pacemakers. Those had weight too, of course, but it was a weight that could be explained, cataloged, placed neatly into the logical order of things. These fragments defied that order. They were not smooth or manufactured, not stainless steel crafted by human hands. They were jagged, ancient in appearance, edges warped as though twisted by a fire far older and deeper than the one I had fed into the furnace hours earlier. I lifted another piece between my thumb and forefinger, turning it slowly. Its surface shimmered faintly, not with the dull gloss of melted steel, but with something darker, a sheen that seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. It was rough to the touch, even through the gloves, the kind of roughness that caught and resisted, making me feel as though it might tear through the material if I pressed too hard. For a moment, I wondered if I should weigh them separately, record the anomaly in the log, make some formal note of the excess. But even as the thought formed, I dismissed it. What would I write? Unexpected fragments found among remains? Unidentifiable metallic pieces present? It would only invite questions. Questions I did not want to answer. Questions I could not answer. The unease deepened as I set the shard back into the tray, listening to the way it struck the other pieces with a faint, unnatural ring. Not the clatter of loose metal, but a resonance, low and almost melodic, as though the fragments shared some hidden frequency. I froze, listening, waiting for the echo to fade, but it lingered longer than it should have, vibrating in the silence until it finally dissolved into nothing. My pulse quickened. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was only the acoustics of the tray, the hollowness amplifying sound, but the explanation felt hollow too, as though I were lying to myself in a language my own body refused to believe. I continued sorting through the remains, brushing the ash aside with more force than necessary, but the more I worked, the more wrong it felt. The bone fragments were too solid, their density resisting the grinder that normally reduced them into the fine consistency families expect when they collect their loved one's ashes. Each piece seemed to hold on, refusing to break down, as though clinging to a form it should have surrendered long ago. And always, scattered throughout, the metallic shards reappeared, glinting faintly in the pale powder, too many to dismiss, too varied to explain away. By then, the weight was not only in the tray, but in my chest, pressing against my ribs with every breath. It was the feeling you get in a room before a storm, when the atmosphere itself seems swollen with anticipation, when every hair on your arm rises, though is no breeze. The kind of weight that tells you something is present, unseen yet undeniable. I tried to shake it off, to remind myself of the ordinary world beyond these walls, of the family waiting for what they believed would be a simple urn of ash. But each time I looked down, each time I saw those alien fragments embedded in the dust, that world felt farther away, replaced by something darker, something older, something I did not want to name. I reached for another shard, larger this time, its edge jagged like broken glass, its center pitted with holes that looked almost organic, like bone eaten through my disease. The instant I touched it, a chill ran through me despite the lingering warmth of the chamber. It was not the cold of metal, not the ordinary chill of steel against glove. It was a deeper cold, one that seeped through the fabric, through the skin, settling in the marrow of my fingers. I dropped it back into the tray with a sharp clink, pulling my hand away as though burned, though no burn remained. I stared at the piece, lying there half buried in ash, and for the first time that night, I truly wished I had not opened the chamber at all. There is a rhythm to cremation, a balance between destruction and reduction, fire and silence. It is supposed to end in nothingness, a return to simplicity, a final purity. But as I stood there, staring at what the fire had left behind, I realized that nothing about this was pure. The ashes were not empty, not resolved. They carried weight, unfamiliar and unyielding, weight that did not belong to the man whose body had entered that chamber. I could not have said what it was, or where it came from, but I knew it did not belong here. And yet it was here all the same, staring back at me from the gray dust, as though daring me to look closer, to recognize what should not exist. And in that moment, with the tray heavy in my hands and the silence pressing against my ears, I knew with a certainty I could not explain. The fire had not erased what it was meant to. It had revealed something else entirely, something that carried more weight than I had ever been prepared to hold. At first, I thought it was nothing more than the tired ringing in my ears, the kind that comes after too many hours of silence, broken only by the mechanical hum of machinery, the scrape of metal against trays, and the dull percussion of bone giving way to instruments. I brushed at the ashes on my gloves, a motion I had performed 1,000 times before without thought, and it was in that simple motion that I heard it something faint, so faint I almost dismissed it as imagination. It was not the hiss of air, nor the settling of powder as it slid from the edge of my hand back onto the tray. It was a sound buried within the sound, muffled, distant, and impossibly alive. It was as though the ashes themselves exhaled a fragment of something that should never have endured the flames. I froze, my hand still hovering above the tray, gray dust sifting slowly back down in a soft cascade. The room was silent, and in that silence, I could have sworn I heard it again. Soft, subtle, a texture more than a word, as though someone were pressing their mouth against a wall and trying to speak through it. I told myself it was nothing, that my nerves were fraying, that the long hours and the unease of those metallic fragments had made me jump at shadows. But as I leaned closer, holding my breath, I realized the sound was not coming from the walls, nor from the hum of the refrigeration units beyond the chamber. It was coming from the dust itself, from the pale heap that had once been a man and now seemed to carry something else within it. I rubbed my gloved fingers together, feeling the grit between them, and the sound grew sharper, more distinct. It was like a murmur now, faint syllables forming only to collapse back into static, as though the ash itself carried memory, or worse, voice. My chest tightened. The rational part of me fought to catalog explanation's resonance, perhaps the faint rasp of powder across latex, the distortion of sound in a sterile chamber, but the part of me that had stood alone in too many silent rooms knew better. There was cadence in it, rhythm, and intent buried in those faint vibrations that no accident of material could create. I set the tray down too hard, the fragments rattling together with that strange low ring that still unnerved me, and the whisper broke off abruptly, like a breath caught in a throat. My heart was pounding now, heavy against my ribs, each beat sounding too loud in the silence. I told myself to walk away, to step out into the hallway, to breathe in the ordinary air of the world beyond, but I couldn't. Something held me there, rooted, compelled to listen again, compelled to test the boundary between what I thought I knew and what I feared might be true. Slowly, I brushed my hand through the ashes once more, dragging the edge of my glove across the surface. And there it was again, undeniable now, a whisper, faint but deliberate, rising like smoke through the particles. It was not clear, not yet, but it was layered, textured, more than just one sound. It was as if voices overlapped within the dust, crowding against one another in desperate attempts to reach through, their tones muffled by the weight of what bound them. My stomach churned, bile sharpened my throat, and yet I bent lower, my ear only inches above the tray, because some part of me needed to know, needed to be certain that I wasn't losing my mind. The whisper thickened the closer I leaned, strands of sound weaving together into something that nearly, almost, resembled words. I could not make them out, not fully, but the cadence was there, syllables pressed into the dust, breaking apart as though crushed by the weight of fire itself. It was not random, and it was not mechanical. It was human, or what was left of human, buried in ash. For a moment, I imagined the impossible, that the man whose body had been reduced in these flames had not left fully, that some part of him clung to these remains, not memory, not spirit, but voice, a final, broken echo trapped in particles too fine to be seen, too fragile to be real, yet unmistakably there. The thought lodged in my chest like a stone, heavy and suffocating. I pulled back sharply, the stool beneath me screeching across the tile, and the whisper receded, but it did not vanish. It lingered just below hearing, a vibration at the edge of perception, waiting, testing, as if mocking me with the knowledge that I had already heard enough to never unhear it. I stood there, trembling despite the heat still radiating from the chamber, and I realized something that made my skin crawl. The ashes were not silent. They never had been. I had simply never listened closely enough before. I should have walked away then. I should have sealed the urn, closed the logbook, and let the dust lie silent on the tray. But something inside me, something twisted between fear and fascination, kept me there. The whisper had unsettled me, yes, but it had also called to me. There was a part of me small, reckless, and entirely against reason that needed to know whether what I had heard was truly the limit of it, or whether the silence still concealed more. So I stayed, standing in that sterile chamber with its humming vents and tiled walls, staring down at the ashes as though they were a mirror that might shift if I only looked long enough. The longer I stood there, the clearer the sensation became. It wasn't just noise. It wasn't static or the scrape of powder. It was layered, intentional, fragments pressing at the edges of hearing, like fingers pressing at the thin skin of a drum. I could feel the sound as much as hear it, vibrating in the air, rattling faintly against my chest, against the fine hairs of my arms. My body recognized it before my mind did. It was voice, multiple voices, overlapping, struggling to surface. I bent down again, unwilling though I was, and let my ear hover over the tray just above the heap of ash. At first, it was the same murmur, the same breathless whisper clawing through the particles. Then, slowly, it deepened. It thickened, as though the dust itself inhaled, gathering strength it shouldn't have had. The whisper sharpened into resonance, and resonance into tone. What had been faint syllables broke apart and reformed into moans, and moans twisted upward into something raw, something jagged and unbearable. Cries. They came all at once, erupting from the ash in overlapping waves, muffled yet piercing, a chorus of anguish pressed flat beneath the weight of silence. They weren't loud, not in the way a scream tears through the air, but their weight was louder than any sound I had ever heard. It was the kind of noise you feel deep in your bones, a vibration that hums against the marrow, making your body ache as though something inside you is trying to claw its way out in response. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the stool, my breath hitching in my throat. The cries didn't stop. They rose, tangled together, each one distinct yet inseparable, as though countless voices had been ground into the same gray dust and were now straining, suffocating, fighting to be heard. Some were high and shrill, like the wails of children. Others were low and guttural, torn from throats heavy with despair. They layered over one another until the air itself seemed to tremble with their desperation. I pressed my gloved hands against my ears, but it didn't matter. The sound was inside me now, bypassing my defenses, vibrating through my teeth, my skull, my chest. I could feel it in the pressure behind my eyes, in the sick churn of my stomach. It wasn't just sound. It was presence, pushing, clawing, demanding to be acknowledged. The tray rattled against the metal counter, as if something had struck it from beneath. Ash leapt into the air in tiny clouds, and with each plume, the cries surged sharper, as though stirred into fresh existence. I staggered forward, trying to press the tray flat, my mind screaming that it was impossible, that nothing living remained there, that fire consumes. That silence should have been absolute, but the screams denied me. They didn't fade. They sharpened. They became words. I couldn't understand them fully, not at first, but fragments rose above the cacophony, begging, pleading half-formed prayers that fractured into sobs. "Help," one voice rasped, stretched thin like a thread about to snap. "Not yet," another croaked, broken with sorrow. Others overlapped in languages I couldn't recognize. Words twisted and blurred, but the tone was unmistakable. Despair. It wasn't a single man's voice that lived in these ashes. It was many, too many, more than there should have been. My legs trembled beneath me, weak with terror. I wanted to run, but I couldn't not while the sound pinned me to the spot, not while the weight of it pressed down on me like a hand on the back of my neck. I could see the air shimmer faintly above the tray, as though heat still lingered in the dust, though the chamber was cold now. It shifted, twisted, forming the barest shapes of mouths open in cries, only to collapse again into formless clouds. I don't know how long I stood there, every instinct inside me screaming to flee, every rational thought fraying under the pressure of the sound. Time stretched, warped, lost its shape in the noise. Seconds might have been minutes, minutes might have been hours. All I knew was that I couldn't endure it much longer. And then, as suddenly as they had risen, the screams cut off. Not fated cut, as though some invisible door had slammed shut between us. The silence that followed was not relief. It was suffocating, worse than the noise, heavy and absolute, pressing in on every side. I realized then that silence is not the absence of sound, but the memory of it, lingering in the mind like an echo that will never quite fade. I stared down at the tray, my chest heaving, and the ash lay still, mute, ordinary, as though nothing had happened at all. But the ringing in my bones, the thrum in my skull, told me otherwise. I had heard them. I had heard all of them. When the echoes finally broke off, when the chamber seemed to swallow the last of those impossible cries, I found myself trembling in a silence that felt heavier than the noise itself. My gloves were gray, coated in the residue I had been sifting, and for a long moment I could not bring myself to move. Every instinct urged me to get rid of the ashes, to sweep them back into the furnace and light it again, to burn whatever still lingered until even memory had no trace. But duty chained me. A family was waiting. They had placed their trust in me, a trust built not on faith but on procedure, on the quiet machine of grief that keeps the world turning even after someone has left it. I could not betray that, not without tearing a hole in the fragile order that allows the living to say goodbye. I forced my hands to steady. The urn sat open on the counter beside the tray, polished, reflective, its surface catching the light from the overhead fixtures like a small mirror. My face looked pale in its curve, almost foreign, as if the man staring back at me was not the same man who had walked into the crematory hours earlier. He was marked now, touched by something he had not asked to see, something that could never be explained. My fingers trembled as I lifted the scoop, pushing the ashes carefully into the urn, grain by grain, bone fragment by bone fragment. And with each motion, I felt as though I was burying the cries beneath my silence. The metal fragments clinked softly against the inside, strange reminders of something that did not belong, and each sound made my jaw tighten until I thought my teeth would crack. I wanted to separate them, to set the metallic pieces aside, to examine them, to prove to myself that they were nothing more than coincidence, scraps of machinery, remnants of a life that had left the body in ordinary ways. But I didn't. I couldn't. My fear of discovery was sharper than my need for understanding. What if they carried more than metal within them? What if disturbing them woke the voices again? My silence became a kind of shield, one I wrapped tightly around myself as I filled the urn to the brim and sealed its lid. By the time I walked back into the reception room, my face had settled into something neutral, practiced. The family stood waiting, their grief folded in on itself, quiet, contained, the way grief so often is when strangers are present. They looked at me with weary eyes, expecting nothing but the return of what was theirs, reduced to dust and memory. My hands felt heavy as I passed the urn across the counter. I wanted to say something, to warn them, to tell them that inside that vessel was not silence, not peace, not purity, but weight, voices, fragments of something that had no right to exist. I wanted to say that I had heard screams where there should have been none, that their loved ones' ashes were not alone. But the words caught in my throat and never left. Instead, I nodded, murmured something quiet and mechanical in apology for their loss, a wish for their peace, and watched as they held the urn like it was both sacred and fragile, like holding it kept their world from unraveling. They thanked me, voices raw but polite, and turned to leave. I stood still, rooted to the floor, watching them walk out into the cold night, carrying something I could not bring myself to name. When the door shut behind them, I felt the silence surge back around me, pressing close, feeling the space where their presence had briefly cut it open. I leaned against the counter, my heart pounding, every muscle in my body tight with restraint. The screams still rang in my skull, though faint now, like echoes in a cavern long abandoned. I wondered if they would hear them too, if one night, holding that urn, one of them might press it close and listen too carefully, and catch the voices hidden in the dust. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I returned to the chamber alone. The tray was clean, wiped down to sterile steel, but I knew the memory of what had happened would never scrub away. I stared at the logbook lying open on the desk, its pages filled with orderly lines of ink dates, times, names, causes of death. My pen hovered above the blank space, waiting for this entry. My mind screamed with what I wanted to write, cries heard in the ashes, metallic fragments unaccounted for, voices that did not belong, but my hand refused. Instead, I wrote the same words I always did: cremation completed without incident, remains collected and transferred. The silence of that lie felt heavier than the screams. It was safer, yes, but safer only in the way. Darkness is safer when you refuse to look at what stands in it. I closed the logbook, pushed the pen aside, and sat there in the suffocating quiet, knowing I had chosen not truth but silence, not warning but concealment. And perhaps that is the true burden of this work. Not the fire, not the bodies, not even the grief of others, but the secrets we keep sealed in urns, in logbooks, in ourselves. Secrets that, if spoken aloud, would tear too many fragile threads at once. When the family was gone and the urn no longer sat between us, I felt the room settle back into a silence that was not peace but suppression. The walls of the crematory seemed to breathe with it, a long exhale of something that had witnessed too much. I sat alone with the logbook still closed, the pen laid across it like a barrier I could not cross. The words I had written no incident stared back at me like a lie carved in stone. And yet I knew they would stand, unquestioned, unchallenged, becoming fact in the bureaucratic rhythm of death. That was the comfort of this place. Not truth, but paperwork, not reality, but procedure. Still, as I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, the screams seemed to rise again from memory, faint but insistent, as if my silence had only given them more room to grow. The crematory had always been my refuge, a place where the work was difficult but predictable, where fire had one purpose: to reduce, to erase, to purify. They say the flame consumes without bias, that it leaves nothing but what is natural to leave bone. Ash fragments that tell a simple story of transformation. But that night, I knew better. I had seen too much, heard too much, to believe in the comfort of fire as a great equalizer. Fire, I realized, does not only consume. Sometimes it preserves. Sometimes it holds on to what should have been erased, as though the heat itself cannot bear to let it vanish completely. I found myself staring at the polished steel of the chamber door, its surface reflecting my outline back to me. For a moment, I saw myself as they must have seen me, the family, waiting with tired eyes and hopeful grief, nothing more than a worker, a custodian of ritual. But beneath that reflection, I imagined another image, the faint shimmer of shapes trapped within the furnace, voices still clawing upward through layers of ash. It was almost as if the reflection was layered, my figure on the surface and something darker pressing against the metal from beneath, straining for release. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the sterile shine of the room, but the feeling remained. I wondered, not for the first time, what I had truly given that family. They had left believing they carried only the remnants of their loved one, purified by fire, reduced to silence. But what if silence is not absence? What if silence is only containment? And what if, in their home, in some quiet hour of the night, they opened that urn not to find peace, but to feel the same echo I had, faint at first, but undeniable, the echo of something that refused to end, The thought tightened in my chest until I could hardly breathe. I leaned forward, pressing my hands together, the fine dust of ash still embedded in the seams of my gloves. No matter how many times I washed, it lingered, invisible, clinging. I imagined it seeping into my skin, carrying with it the muffled cries, the fragments of something that had resisted the fire. Perhaps that was the truest horror of all. Not what stayed inside the urn, but what followed me out of the chamber. What lived now in the creases of my own flesh. What waited in my silence to surface again. The clock on the wall ticked forward with steady indifference, each second a reminder that life outside the crematory continued, oblivious. Cars passed on distant roads. People laughed in warm kitchens. The world turned without knowledge of the voices sealed in ash. I envied them that ignorance. To them, fire was final, the clean line between before and after. To me, it had become something else entirely, a reminder that some things cannot be burned away, no matter how hot the flames. I wrote nothing more in the logbook. I could not bring myself to. Instead, I closed it with deliberate care, sliding it back into its drawer as though sealing my silence alongside it. The truth remained unwritten, pressed against the back of my teeth, heavy in my chest. Perhaps that was for the best. What would truth accomplish, anyway? No one would believe it, and those who did would only inherit the same weight I carried. Better, perhaps, to let the fire's secret remain unspoken, to let the world believe in purity, in closure, in silence. Still, as I locked the chamber and turned out the lights, I could not help but think of the words I had once heard repeated in training. Words meant to comfort, meant to remind us of the simplicity of our duty. The fire purifies. But as I stood there in the dark, listening to the memory of cries woven into silence, I knew that was not always true. Sometimes fire does not purify. Sometimes it only hides what it cannot destroy. Sometimes it guards what should never escape. And with that thought, I left the crematory, carrying with me not peace, but a shadow that no flame had the power to consume.